the bones don't tell the story, not this time. 5,000 years ago, across Europe and Asia, the graves all looked the same. Quiet, ordinary, unremarkable. But in the DNA buried inside them, something impossible was hiding. At some point between 5,000 and 3,000 BCE, almost 9 out of 10 male bloodlines vanished. Not a local famine, not a single war, a continent-wide erasure of fathers, sons, and brothers. We didn't know it until 2015, when 2 genetic studies, one in Science by Monica Carmen, another in genome research by Bottleneck and colleagues, mapped what they called the Y-chromosome bottleneck. It wasn't about the number of men who lived and died. It was about which lineages survived. In evolutionary terms, the male family tree collapsed overnight. The mitochondrial DNA, passed from mothers, stayed stable, but the Y chromosome, carried only by men, imploded. 10 maternal lines for every surviving paternal one. 10 women's bloodlines for every man's that made it through. And the pattern wasn't random. It appeared first in Eurasia, from the Danube Plains to the Caspian Steppe, right where Neolithic farming cultures were fading and something new, harder, and hungrier was rising in their place. Archaeologists called it the dawn of the Bronze Age, but in reality, it was a biological turning point, when human evolution stopped being shaped by nature and started being shaped by us. Because the collapse wasn't caused by plague or climate or chance, it was caused by selection, violent, social, and sexual. By that time, Europe's first farming societies, the people of the funnel beaker and Tropolier cultures, had built vast villages, farmed peacefully, buried their dead with care. Then they disappeared, replaced almost entirely by new cultures like corded ware and bell beaker, carrying the genetic signature of steppe herders, the Yamnaya, tall, mobile, pastoral warriors from the grasslands north of the Black Sea. They brought horses, wagons, and patrilineal clans that lived and died by male dominance. When the dust settled, nearly all the Y chromosomes in Europe were theirs. The others, the sons of the Neolithic farmers, had been erased. This wasn't a genocide in the modern sense. It was something deeper, a biological restructuring of who got to reproduce and who didn't. Across the steppe and beyond, the same pattern emerged. Few men fathered many children. Most men fathered none. The genetic record reads like a ledger of power, a few signatures written again and again, while all the others fade into silence. It's one of the most brutal truths evolution ever wrote. When the wars ended, the women who survived didn't just rebuild villages, they rebuilt humanity. They chose, consciously or not, the traits that had survived the chaos: dominance, resilience, and the social intelligence to wield them. The world that rose from that silence wasn't just ruled by stronger men. It was shaped by women who, for the first time in history, had to decide what kind of man was worth surviving with. And what they chose still defines us. When the world came back from silence, it didn't return to the one that had fallen. It was smaller, meaner, sharper. A place rebuilt by those who had outlasted extinction, and by the women who had chosen them. The Neolithic villages that once dotted Europe's rivers were gone. Their longhouses stood empty, swallowed by weeds. The communal fields, once carved by stone plows and shared among families, had become battlegrounds for a new order, one that traded cooperation for conquest. Archaeologists call the transition abrupt. One century, you have the funnel beaker and Tropolier cultures, farmers, potters, traders, their graves egalitarian and their DNA stable. The next, they vanish, replaced by men with wagons, livestock, and weapons of copper. The Yamnaya had arrived, pastoralists from the Pontic Caspian steppe whose herds stretched farther than most villages could imagine. They brought the wheel, the horse, and something far more dangerous: the clan. Their power came not from kings or cities, but from brotherhoods, patrilineal alliances where loyalty flowed through blood and blade. In 2007, archaeologist David W. Anthony, in The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, described these people as a network of mobile chiefdoms organized around kinship and herding, capable of moving whole households hundreds of kilometers in a season. He reached this conclusion after analyzing isotopic data from horse teeth and wagon tracks along the Volga-Don corridor. The physical evidence of nomadic range. Power, he wrote, was no longer tethered to place, but to people and movement. In other words, for the first time, mobility was might. Every Yamnaya mound, each kurgan, was more than a tomb. It was a declaration of continuity. Archaeologist J.P. Mallory, in Search of the Indo-Europeans, published in 1989, noted that the kurgan was both grave and monument, the living soil raised over the dead to proclaim descent. He observed recurring east-facing burials and standardized grave goods, evidence of a belief system where ancestry itself was sacred. By 3000 BCE, those mounds spread like wildfire across the continent. From the Carpathians to the Rhine, from the Volga to the Balkans, the DNA inside them carried the same paternal mark, R1A and R1B. Geneticist Iosif Lazaridis and colleagues, writing in 2014 in Nature, concluded that steppe pastoralists contributed up to 3/4 of the ancestry of Central Europe. After 2500 BCE, they extracted and sequenced genome fragments from ancient bones to trace that surge, a replacement so sudden it rewrote the genetic map of Europe within centuries. The old farming cultures were absorbed. Their women, too. Their sons, mostly gone. Yet something remarkable followed. The chaos had cleared the field. The few surviving male lineages, the warriors, the negotiators, the tacticians, became the foundation of the next 5 millennia. Because after violence came a different kind of selection. The wars had decided who could seize power. Now women would decide who could keep it. The Bronze Age steppe demanded composure, not rage. Herds had to be managed, alliances maintained, winters endured. Dominance mattered, but so did control. Archaeologist Christian Christiansen, in Europe Before History, Cambridge University Press, 1998, described this era as a system of ranked networks, bound by gift, kinship, and trust, fragile but self-reinforcing through marriage and exchange. He saw in the graves of the corded ware and bell beaker cultures clear hierarchies, rich male burials surrounded by women from far-off lands. To test that mobility, researchers T. Douglas Price and Christopher Knipper conducted strontium isotope analysis on teeth from Neolithic and Bronze Age cemeteries, published in Antiquity, 2011. The ratio of isotopes revealed where each person had grown up. They found that many of the women buried beside elite men had been born hundreds of kilometers away. Price and Knipper concluded that female exogamy was a structural mechanism linking communities over long distances. In simpler terms, marriage had become migration, and female choice, once personal, had turned political. Every union reinforced hierarchy, stabilizing power in a world still raw from catastrophe. Each generation's children inherited dominance not just through blood, but through behavior. The Y-chromosome bottleneck hadn't merely erased men, it had compressed evolution, forcing it through a gate so narrow that only certain traits could pass. Dominance, control, strategic violence, and the ability to be chosen. These became the building blocks of the Bronze Age male as the steppe clans expanded, bringing their herds, their gods, and their languages into Europe's heart. They carried with them a new template for masculinity. A world that had once been communal was now hierarchical, and the women who had survived the wars were now deciding which hierarchies would last. The old human order had ended in blood, but the new one, the one that would shape everything from myth to marriage, began in bed. Power used to be about survival. Now it was about memory, about being worth remembering. After the genetic culling, power itself changed shape. The men who remained weren't just survivors of violence, they were its descendants, shaped by it from birth to bone. And in the centuries that followed, the same traits that once decided who conquered land, aggression, dominance, control, became the very traits that decided who passed on their genes. Across the early Bronze Age, that shift is visible in the ground itself. At the Serbian site of Mokrin, dated to around 2100 BCE, archaeologist Sofia Stefanovic and her colleagues analyzed burials for a 2011 paper in PLOS ONE. They found that elite male graves, filled with copper tools, ornaments, and weapons, belonged to men who had fathered larger families. In Stefanovic's words, social inequality was biologically reinforced. The rich were literally reproducing more. In short, hierarchy now reproduced itself. Sex had become social currency, and violence was its exchange rate. But this wasn't random chaos or endless bloodshed. It was something more deliberate, violence with a plan. Anthropologist Peter Turchin, writing in his book Ultra Society, 2016, calls this pattern collective aggression. He explains that as human groups grew larger, The most successful weren't the most violent, but the most organized. Those who could control violence within their ranks in order to prevail against outsiders. It wasn't the bloodthirsty who thrived, it was the disciplined. That's when selection turns subtle, because in the aftermath of the Y-chromosome collapse, women weren't just choosing men who survived. They were choosing men who could control survival itself. Men who could kill, but didn't need to prove it every day. The calm before violence became more seductive than violence itself. That tension, strength under restraint, began to leave its trace in human biology and attraction. In 2012, evolutionary psychologist Aaron Sell and his team published findings in Proceedings of the Royal Society B, showing that across cultures, women rated men as most attractive, not when they appeared simply strong, but when they seemed capable of aggression, yet unlikely to misuse it. Sell summarized it as a paradox. Women preferred men who could protect, not dominate. It's the same ancient equation that first appeared in the Bronze Age, the dangerous protector. In the steppe world, that paradox became the definition of masculinity. Yamnaya chiefs weren't just warriors, they were mediators, entrusted with the monopoly on violence. They alone could punish, defend, or avenge, a power structure that sociologist Max Weber, thousands of years later, would call the legitimate use of force. And that monopoly made them desirable, because in a world still rebuilding from chaos, safety and status had become indistinguishable. Even mythology kept that pattern alive. In the Indo-European world, heroes like Indra, Achilles, or Thor were half gods, half destroyers. Men whose worth came not from how much blood they spilled, but from their control over it. As myths evolved, violence was recast as sacred duty, a test of worth. The cult of the warrior became the world's first moral code. If you must rule, rule through fear, but never be ruled by it. Anthropologist David G. Gilmour, writing in Manhood in the Making in 1990, spent decades studying male identity across cultures and came to a strikingly similar conclusion. He found that in societies from the Mediterranean to Polynesia, true manhood required a blend of courage and composure, aggression tempered by restraint, meaning real men fought, but they fought with discipline. That same behavioral script had already been written in the Bronze Age. It began here, courage without chaos, dominance without collapse. So when violence became attractive, it wasn't brutality that won. It was composure, the face that could hide fury, the hand that could lift a blade or lower it. And from that moment on, evolution found a new direction. Social power, persuasion, charisma, all became new ways of fighting without fighting. The battle for survival had moved from the field to the mind, and once again, attraction would be the judge of who mastered it. By the time the swords rusted, a new kind of weapon had taken their place, the mind. The men who ruled the early Bronze Age weren't always the strongest. They were the ones who could turn strength into strategy, who could keep allies close, enemies guessing, and women convinced that safety lay within their circle. Archaeology captures that shift like a snapshot of evolution midstream. In Central Europe, the Uniatids culture, flourishing around 2200 BCE, left behind burials that look less like the spoils of war and more like boardrooms in the dirt. Weapons lay beside objects of negotiation, amber beads from the Baltic, obsidian from the Carpathians, and gold that had traveled from the Aegean. Archaeologist Bettina Arnold, writing in World Archaeology in 2016, examined the chemical fingerprints of these artifacts and traced trade routes stretching across thousands of kilometers. Her conclusion was striking. These goods weren't trophies, they were messages, signs of social deals struck through gift exchange and alliance. Power had become portable, traded, gifted, and inherited through trust. That transformation mirrors what primatologist Robin Dunbar would later call the social brain hypothesis in his 1998 paper in the Journal of Human Evolution. Dunbar's work began with a simple observation. Among primates, bigger groups meant bigger brains. He compared brain size and average group size across 36 primate species and found a direct correlation. Humans, with the largest neocortex of all, fell exactly where the pattern predicted, supporting groups of around 150 individuals, the famous Dunbar's number. That limit, he argued, wasn't cultural. It was neurological. The size of our social world, Dunbar wrote, is set by the capacity of our minds to model the minds of others. In other words, brains evolved to handle gossip before they evolved to handle war. But that intelligence came with a price tag. Neuroanthropologist Susanna Herculano Huzel, publishing in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience in 2009, wanted to know exactly how expensive the human brain was to run. She dissolved brain tissue samples from multiple primate species, literally turning them into microscopic suspensions, and counted neurons one by one. Her data showed that the human brain contains about 86 billion neurons, 3 times more than a gorilla's, and consumes about 20% of our total energy at rest. As Herculano Huzel explained, social cognition is metabolically costly, but evolution paid the price. It bought us foresight, the ability to predict betrayal, trade favors, and manipulate hierarchies without bloodshed. That same intelligence soon infiltrated mating. In 2013, psychologist David M. Buss and his team at the University of Texas surveyed over 10,000 people from 37 cultures for a paper in Personality and Individual Differences. Participants ranked what they found most attractive in a long-term partner. Across every region, from hunter-gatherers to industrial societies, the results were identical. Traits like humor, verbal intelligence, and social confidence consistently outranked physical dominance or aggression. Buss summarized it simply. Intelligence and kindness are the modern equivalents of strength and bravery. Even in societies shaped by warfare, women preferred men who could persuade, negotiate, or unite, those who could talk others into peace, or into war when needed. Anthropologist Joseph Henrich later called this feedback loop cultural gene co-evolution in a 2016 article for Nature Human Behavior. He described how prestige, once earned through combat, began attaching itself to communication, storytelling, teaching, leadership. Henrich based his conclusion on long-term fieldwork in the Peruvian Amazon, studying the Matsugenka people. He observed that men who shared knowledge, how to fish, hunt, or build canoes, enjoyed more social influence and had more children, even without wealth or violence. Cooperation, he wrote, can become as sexually attractive as dominance once did. And that's how charisma became a survival tool. The human brain rewired itself to treat conversation like combat and reputation like armor. The most dangerous men were no longer those with the sharpest blades, but those who could convince everyone else to use theirs first. Even language itself became a weapon, or perhaps a kind of truce. In 2015, linguist Asko Parpala published an analysis in the Transactions of the Philological Society, tracing how Proto-Indo-European languages spread across Eurasia. He concluded it couldn't have happened through conquest alone. Instead, he proposed a model of elite emulation, local peoples adopting the speech and customs of high-status leaders. Language, in Parpala's words, became the ultimate tool of power, domination through imitation rather than destruction. By then, evolution had shifted again. The same pressures that once rewarded aggression now rewarded articulation. Dominance still mattered, but now it had to sound good. And as women continued to choose men who could offer both safety and status through persuasion, human courtship transformed. Wit replaced warfare. Charm replaced chaos. The heart became the new battlefield, and conversation the new weapon. Our ancestors had learned one of evolution's oldest lessons. Sometimes, the clever survive longer than the cruel. For most of human history, survival was a group effort. Desire changed that. Once the dust of prehistory settled, love, or what we like to call love, became one of the most powerful evolutionary forces on Earth. Not because it was romantic, but because it was efficient. Evolutionary biologist Jeffrey Miller explored this in his 2000 book, The Mating Mind. To test his idea, he looked at traits that seemed useless for survival: art, music, humor, creativity, and asked why they existed at all. He found patterns linking these skills to mating success across both fossil evidence and modern data on sexual behavior. Miller argued that these abilities were courtship displays, the human version of a peacock's tail. Signals advertising intelligence, health, and emotional control. After the Y-chromosome bottleneck, such displays became tests. Could a man create, plan, and stay calm under pressure? Desire, Miller said, wasn't random. It was intelligence showing off. Anthropologist Sarah Hrdy, writing in Mothers and Others in 2009, examined maternal cooperation among primates and early humans to understand how females shaped evolution. She combined field observations of apes with cross-cultural data on child rearing, and found that human mothers rely on extended networks, sisters, grandmothers, friends, to raise offspring who take nearly 2 decades to reach independence. That burden made female choice strategic. Hertie put it simply. Women didn't just pick genes. They picked partners who would help them survive the next 20 years. Desire became a cognitive screening process for stability and alliance, a quiet form of risk management disguised as emotion. Psychologist David M. Buss took that logic global in a series of studies summarized in Evolutionary Psychology and Human Mating, 2019. Buss and his team surveyed more than 10,000 participants from 60 cultures, asking what traits they sought in a partner. The data were astonishingly consistent. Across continents, languages, and religions, women prioritized intelligence, emotional steadiness, and the potential to provide or cooperate. As Buss wrote, these aren't modern preferences. They're ancient solutions to ancient problems. They're behavioral fossils from an age when every wrong choice could end a bloodline. Even the brain still carries that design. Neuroscientists Helen Fisher and Lucy Brown used functional MRI scans to study people who had recently fallen in love, publishing their results in 2016 in the Journal of Comparative Neurology. They scanned volunteers while showing them photos of their partners and discovered that romantic love activated the same reward and stress control circuits that evolved to keep early humans calm during danger. Fisher explained it simply. Love is the body's most natural form of stress regulation. The same chemicals that once helped protect families from predators now help people protect relationships from falling apart. During the Bronze Age, that chemistry built civilizations. Marriage networks weren't sentimental, they were biological treaties. Each alliance tied one family's survival to another's, merging reproduction with diplomacy. Historian Anthony Harding, in Bronze Age Lives, 2021, studied burial records and trade routes from the Yamnaya to the early Mycenaeans and found that the spread of goods, languages, and myths followed the same corridors as marriage exchanges. Desire, quite literally, globalized humanity, but efficiency came with a cost. Evolution favors what looks reliable, not necessarily what is. Psychologist and science writer Maria Konnikova, in a 2015 Scientific American essay, pointed out that the brain often mistakes the appearance of competence for the real thing. In her words, we judge confidence before we can measure skill. That bias, once useful for making quick choices in dangerous times, now lets charisma disguise character. The same selection that rewarded empathy also made us easy to manipulate. Still, the system worked. Generation after generation, attraction refined its pattern. Dominance balanced by intelligence, confidence softened by calm, aggression shaped into charm. Desire became the great sculptor of civilization, deciding not only who survived, but who thrived. By then, the wars that once reshaped humanity were no longer fought with axes. They were fought with glances, stories, and promises. The battlefield had moved inside the mind. Every age leaves bones. Some you can dig up, some you carry inside your head. The world that rose after the bottleneck didn't just reshape DNA, it rewired emotion. The survivors passed down more than blood. They passed down instincts. Who to fear, who to trust, who to want. And those instincts are still here, etched into how we love, compete, and belong. That ancient collapse squeezed humanity through a genetic funnel so tight it changed behavior itself. What came out the other side was a species built for empathy, but addicted to hierarchy. Biologist Richard Francis, in his 2015 book, Domesticated: Evolution in a Human World, called this balance adaptive aggression, writing that humans learn to play nice within their group, but to keep their claws for outsiders. In other words, evolution turned us into social strategists, kind within our circle, wary toward everyone else. It's that duality that made us both cooperative and competitive. The friendliest species on Earth, but one that never lost its edge. Modern neuroscience still finds traces of this split in the brain. In a 2020 study published in Nature Human Behavior, Jean Dussetti and his team at the University of Chicago tested over 300 participants, using both brain imaging and behavioral empathy tasks. Their results showed that empathy is selective. It lights up most intensely for those we recognize as part of our group, and dims for strangers. As Dussetti and his co-authors put it, empathic concern is preferentially mobilized toward members of one's in-group. In plain language, we feel for our own more than for others. Our compassion is tribal, not universal, a leftover reflex from the ancient world where helping outsiders could mean risking your life. Even our hormones still play by those same prehistoric rules. Endocrinologist Dario Maestripieri, in a 2018 article for Hormones and Behavior, reviewed decades of testosterone research and found that the hormone rises sharply not just during fights, but in status competition. Moments like arguments, job interviews, or athletic contests. He wrote that the male endocrine system responds to challenges of dominance with a physiological profile akin to combat readiness. Translated into everyday terms, your body treats a tense meeting like a tribal duel. The same chemistry that once decided who led a raid now decides who gets promoted. And that urge to take risks, to perform under the gaze of others, hasn't gone anywhere either. A 2019 meta-analysis in Evolution and Human Behavior examined more than 50 studies and found that men take significantly greater physical and financial risks when women are watching, or when competing with other men. The authors concluded that risk-taking is modulated by sexual signaling context. That's science's way of saying it's a mating ritual, not a mystery. What used to be a show of courage in battle has simply migrated to the modern stage. Business, sport, or social media. Our anxieties tell the same story. Psychiatrist Randolph Nesse, one of the founders of evolutionary medicine, wrote in Good Reasons for Bad Feelings back in 2019 that our emotions evolved for a life under constant social judgment. In other words, anxiety wasn't built for calm times. It was meant to keep us alert to exclusion, betrayal, or failure, things that once could cost our lives. That's why modern stress feels so personal, even when the stakes are trivial. To the brain, being ignored online or humiliated in a meeting triggers the same alarms as being exiled from the tribe. Women, too, inherited their own form of vigilance. In a 2013 paper in Psychological Science, psychologists Lida Cosmides and John Tooby ran experiments using facial and vocal cues to measure threat detection. They found that women were especially accurate at identifying dominance and aggression in male expressions and tones of voice, even when the signals were subtle. They concluded that female perceptual systems are tuned for early detection of male coercion. Put simply, the female mind evolved to spot danger before it struck, a survival tool that still hums quietly in the background of modern life. Even love carries the memory of fear. Neuroscientist Larry Young, in a 2015 article for Nature Review's Neuroscience, explained that the neurochemicals that bond us, oxytocin and vasopressin, evolved directly from the same systems that once regulated stress and panic. He wrote, "The neural circuits mediating social attachment appear to have evolved from those regulating responses to threat." In other words, the same biology that soothed panic after danger now anchors our deepest bonds. Love, at the molecular level, is just fear with a familiar face. All these traces, empathy with bias, attraction to dominance, risk under pressure, are psychological fossils of ancient selection. Once, they kept us alive. Now, they quietly steer our choices. They shape how we build hierarchies, how we define success, how we choose partners and leaders. The men rewarded by prehistory still echo in the traits rewarded by algorithms, and the old terror of being unchosen. That silence that once erased 9 out of 10 lineages still drives ambition now. We like to think the past is buried, but the truth is it's closer than that. It's in the hormones that surge when we're challenged. It's in the heat behind a glance. It's in the part of us that still believes survival depends on being wanted. Every advantage leaves a scar, and the traits that once pulled us out of chaos, ambition, hierarchy, dominance, are still working. They just don't know when to stop. The world we live in today runs on the same software written 5,000 years ago. We still reward the bold, the loud, the tireless. We still confuse confidence for competence, and we still mistake control for safety. But the environment that forged those instincts is gone. Back then, life was fragile and short. Power meant survival. Now those same reflexes are running inside billion-person societies, and they're overheating. Neurobiologist Robert Sapolsky wrote in Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst, that our biology was built for small tribes, not entire civilizations. Our stress systems evolved for brief bursts of danger, a predator, a rival, a sudden famine, not for the constant background noise of modern life. And that's the cruel joke of evolution. We're still reacting to Slack pings, traffic jams, and unread emails with the same cortisol spike our ancestors felt when the village was on fire. The threats sound trivial, but the chemistry doesn't care. To the brain, humiliation, delay, or disapproval feel as deadly as hunger once did. The drive for dominance that once built civilizations now drives burnout. A 2018 review in The Lancet Psychiatry found that chronic workplace stress mirrors the same hormone surges seen in soldiers after battle. Different battlefields, same wiring. Our ancestors fought for survival. We fight for relevance. And it's mostly men who still carry that evolutionary overclocking. From ambition to risk-taking, the old mating display traits never really switched off. They just changed costumes. Psychotherapist Terry Real calls it performance masculinity. The war men fight against themselves in the name of proving worth. We inherited a mind that can conquer anything except the need to conquer. But freedom hasn't been simple for women either. Technology and law gave them what evolution once denied: choice. Childbirth became safer, property became possible, autonomy became real. Yet every freedom came with a new weight. Sociologist Eva Illouz observed in The End of Love that modern women gained the right to choose, but also the burden of endless self-presentation, always performing confidence, competence, desirability. And psychologist Jean Twenge, comparing decades of mental health data, found that rates of anxiety and depression among women have climbed steadily since the 1950s, rising in lockstep with opportunity. Independence freed them from others' control, but bound them to their own expectations. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes once said that female freedom was bought by breaking the link between fertility and survival. Yet breaking it didn't end pressure. It only moved it inward. In the past, women were controlled by men. Today, many are controlled by the fear of falling behind. Meanwhile, empathy, the trait that once made us human, carries its own flaw. Psychologist Paul Bloom argued in Against Empathy that compassion evolved as a narrow spotlight, not a floodlight, guiding care toward what feels close and familiar. That bias, once vital for kin survival, now shapes politics, inequality, and outrage. We don't lack empathy, we just aim it badly. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all, the same instincts that made us dominant as a species may also undo us. Historian Yuval Noah Harari wrote in Sapiens that humanity conquered the world but remains discontent, as if our minds are still running ancient code on modern hardware. We built skyscrapers, networks, and algorithms, yet our brains still whisper the same prehistoric fears, that there isn't enough, that someone else is winning, that safety lies in control. So we keep running the old race, long after the finish line moved. Men burn out to feel worthy, women exhaust themselves proving freedom, and everyone lives under the same ancient alarm, blaring for reasons that would make our ancestors laugh, but still keeping us awake at night. Because evolution never taught us how to stop, only how to keep going. That's the hidden cost of the world the survivors built. We inherited their strength, but not their peace, their hunger, but not their need. Our ancestors fought to survive the world. We're the first generation fighting to survive ourselves. The bones still don't tell the story. Not this part. 5,000 years after the silence, the descendants of that shattered world walk streets their ancestors couldn't have imagined. Towers instead of kurgans, cities instead of steppe. But the code inside us hasn't changed much. It still hums in the background, an ancient language written in cortisol and craving. When the wars ended, the women who survived didn't just rebuild villages, they rewrote evolution. They chose men who could endure chaos, who could protect, provide, and persuade. They chose strength with restraint, intelligence with danger, control with empathy. And without knowing it, they built the blueprint of the modern mind. That legacy still defines us. Our careers, our competition, our romances, all faint echoes of that first selective moment when survival began to depend on being chosen. Every argument about ambition, every insecurity about status, every longing to be seen, they're just new ways of saying the same old thing. I'm still here. Don't erase me. Yet something has shifted again. For most of history, selection favored power. But in the quiet corners of this century, we're starting to value something different. Kindness, calm, self-control. We've begun, perhaps, to rediscover the long path of self-domestication that our ancestors once abandoned. The idea that survival doesn't belong to the strongest, but to those who can live gently in a crowded world. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham once said that our species became civilized not by taming nature, but by taming ourselves. Maybe the next step isn't to conquer what's left of the world, It's to make peace with the parts of us still at war. Because for all our history of dominance and desire, one truth remains. Evolution doesn't stop at survival. It stops at understanding. The same women who once chose who would father the future never knew what that future would become. They couldn't have imagined that their quiet decisions, born of fear, resilience, and necessity, would echo through every boardroom, battlefield, and bedroom that followed. But they did, and here we are, still carrying their questions in our blood, still deciding what kind of people are worth surviving with. So maybe the real question now isn't about them, it's about us. If ancient women once shaped the world by choosing which men would survive, who's doing the choosing today? Algorithms? Economies? Ideologies? Are we evolving toward empathy? Or just perfecting new forms of dominance? Have the roles reversed? Or just changed costume? Tell me what you think. What kind of world are we selecting for now? And who will inherit it? Let's talk about it in the comments. Till next time, keep listening to the echoes